October the 31st, year unknown. The dead roamed the streets. I needed to find solace, a safe place, a shelter from the hordes of the living dead. And that's how I came to the house. And so that brings us to now. I need to record what I've seen, lest I die silently in this dreadful place. This may be the last thing I ever write, but the secrets I have uncovered shall not die with me tonight. Survival horror, a staple of gaming. Made famous by games like Resident Evil or Silent Hill in the late 90s, survival horror has been a very popular genre up until this day, even if it has become slightly diluted in areas. Recently, Resident Evil 7 has been released, and it is praised for returning to the roots of the series and the genre, and many fans do wish for a return to form for survival horror, back to where it started, before the more action-orientated stagnation of recent years. First, let's talk about what survival horror is. According to Wikipedia, survival horror is a subgenre of video games inspired by horror fiction that focuses on survival of the character as the game tries to frighten players with either horror graphics or scary ambience. In other words, they are games in which the player feels very unempowered and fighting against unknowable odds just to stay alive, as the name implies. It's not so much about killing defeating evil as much as it is about making it out alive and in one piece. Survival horror mostly has its roots in horror cinema, such as the slasher film subgenre, with iconic titles such as Halloween, Friday the 13th, or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in which a powerful killer is stalking a protagonist, and the peril that is the driving focus is not so much a fight, but the protagonist's efforts to make it out alive from this situation. Now that we've properly defined and clarified what survival horror really means, let's look back. Fans call for a return to the origins of the genre, but what really is that? When did the game really first appear? Let's start in the early 80s, when arcades reached the height of their popularity, and early PC systems such as the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum came to be very popular and widespread use. From what I could find, the first ever video game matching the modern descriptions of the survival horror genre, and perhaps even horror games of all, was Nostromo, released on early systems of the Commodore PET 2001 and PC 6001. I could find no footage of the game on the internet, and very little information on the game at all in general. It seems to have taken a lot of its inspiration from the incredibly popular movie Alien, hinted in its name being a reference to the ship on which the movie takes place. In the game, the player had to manage resources and hide from a monster that prowled around on a spaceship. Whilst this might be the first horror game, though, it doesn't seem like it was hugely influential to the growth of the genre due to its lack of attention, as well as not being identified as an early survival horror title. Yes, it does fit modern definitions of survival horror, but it certainly didn't brand itself in those regards, and was more of a unique experience back in the day, and certainly wasn't hugely popular as modern survival horror seems to be. It should also come as no surprise, given the information that I've imparted so far, that over the next couple of years, a number of survival horror games did release based on popular slasher and horror movies, such as Halloween, which we've already mentioned, and as well as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre on Atari 2600, and Alien and the Evil Dead on Commodore 64. But when was the genre made a little bit more mainstream? So far, what we've been looking at are some very obscure and buried titles, most of which aren't actually very good from what I've played. And whilst they may have been the first, they can't truly be the origins of survival horror because they are as hidden as they are. I mean, they never, as I've already mentioned, they never describe themselves as survival horror, they simply fit modern definitions. So, I think we're going to have to look a little bit further into the future, maybe stop digging so deep, and really just look at a surface level, and maybe it's not as complex as we think. What is regarded by many to be the first proper survival horror game to give birth to the genre's mainstream appeal was 1989's Sweet Home, released on the Japanese Nintendo Famicom, but never the globalized NES, so, that makes me doubt its influential nature if it was only released in the Japanese region. It was based on the Japanese horror title of the same name, and took on a very similar plot. It included many RPG mechanics, such as party management and item collection. I would say probably because these mechanics and stylings were very popular at the time. The game does have, in my opinion, a fucking awesome soundtrack, and was pretty damn fun to play on an emulator. All in all, I call Sweet Home an interesting piece of history, and definitely a title worth checking out if you do enjoy both classic JRPGs and survival horror. But it doesn't quite adhere to the tropes that I would say define survival horror, and again, like the previous titles, it doesn't really seem to describe itself as survival horror. So, I give up. I've been looking for perhaps an earlier origin to survival horror than we all thought there was. I was hoping that maybe Nostromo or one of the earlier slasher film games might have been the real roots of the genre, but it seems it's a lot simpler than that. It seems that the answer is really just those original titles that always come to mind. So, now that we've got those lurking earlier titles out of the way, we can skip a few years forward and come to the games that everybody knows and loves. The first is Resident Evil, in 1996 on the Sony PlayStation, a game that's received remasters and sequels over and over since its release. It's definitely a good game, and its mechanics and camera angles are also very reminiscent of that of the horror movies I referenced before, which is definitely really interesting to see for me. Personally, I find the whole interconnectedness and holistic approach to horror media to be very interesting indeed, seeing how films influence games and vice versa. Now, Resident Evil, as I mentioned, has received many sequels and a couple of remasters as the original, and they're definitely very good games, or at least the earlier ones, and I haven't played Resident Evil 7, but that seems to be similar. But later on in their timeline, especially with the Resident Evil 5 and 6, they became noted by many people to be very stagnated. They became more action orientated. There's that scene in Resident Evil 6 where you like drive a tank through a museum or whatever and detonate a nuclear bomb. I think that was that game, I did a different game. And it just is that's kind of lost its roots, and it's good to see that going back there. Following Resident Evil was, of course, its sequel Resident Evil 2, and then Silent Hill, another very popular classic survival horror title that has received many sequels, remasters and movies just like Resident Evil. Silent Hill, though, focuses more on a psychological aspect. There's a lot of reflections, of emotions, and there's very interesting deep stuff that I don't really want to get into here. These two titles definitely do seem to me to be the primary genesis of the genre's popularity, and they seem to have still be the pillars of survival horror today. They remain popular, and certainly have my congratulations to be the parents of a genre so beloved. So, everybody, I went on a little adventure today to see if I could find the earliest examples of survival horror, and to see if maybe there was a secret key to the start of all this, but it seems my search was in vain. It seems that I spent so long trying to conquer the evil that it has gone to me. Thank you very much for watching. Seriously, I really appreciate it. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode of Cooking with Code, the game design series with a pinch of salt, although I turned down on the salt a little bit for this one because the whole, spooky Halloween thing. Cut to the end card. Woo!
Spooky, scary skeletons and shivers down your spine. Shrieking skulls will shock your soul, seal your doom tonight. Spooky, scary skeletons speak with such a screech. You'll shake and shudder in surprise when you hear these zombies shriek.
Now, it's time for me to sign off.